Next up, Geoff Huston, AP, presenting his view on addressing 2016.
Which I now have 25 minutes for, thank you. This is something I normally do once a year, and it normally comes up at APNIC meetings, but John saw it and Leslie, I think, and said, why not? And hopefully you'll find it interesting. I'm trying to look at what happened last year, just what happened in addressing. And this is a slide you've always seen. It's the IPv6 allocations by RIR. Up and to the right, bit of 2017, nothing kind of not obvious. You know, V6 is growing, you'd think, but you'd be wrong. Because if you look at the amount of allocated addresses, as a world system, we tend to spin out about a /20 per year, but each RIR varies dramatically in the amount of addresses it actually hands out in V6 every year. So the vertical scale doesn't matter. It's actually /32s or the equivalent. But you notice that, you know, approximately a /20 leaves the factory and has done since about 2011. But, you know, that big yellow thing is ripe. Some years ripe is enormous. The light blue stuff is ARIN. Let's just look at ARIN. Massive allocation in 2008. Another whopper in 2013. Some years are big, some years are small. Now, part of this is V6 itself. What we've done is amplified the differences between large and small. So it's relatively easy, as far as I can tell, to get a minimum allocation, which is probably a /32. But it's possible to get a /20, which is 10 bits bigger. 2 to the 10th, 1,000. So it's 1,000 times larger. So now big is really, really big. And at the times when you do big allocations, it just pops right the way through. So oddly enough, it's not even in that respect to everyone. It's just some of the big ones really dominate. And then I started to get really interested because we do country codes. We actually sort of say, if I give this allocation, I gave it to X, and X kind of claims that they live in country whatever. And so since 2012, these are the largest 10 allocations every single year. And it makes fascinating reading. Number 1, 2012, Argentina. You'd never have thought. But of course the telco there was probably doing some kind of planned rollout, so all of a sudden 4,000 /32s are allocated into Argentina. The next year is more like V4. Number 1 US, number 2 China. Because for the last 4 years of V4, it was either China or the US got the largest allocations every single year. There's a lot of Chinese, and the US infrastructure is incredibly well developed, so there's a lot of demand. So between large numbers of folk and sophisticated infrastructure, large demand, you tended to see most of the allocations going there, but not in V6. For 2 years, 13 and 14, United States and China, but, you know, where's the US in 2016? It's down at rank 4, where's China down at rank 10? Because once you've got it, it's hard to get another. They're so big, it's not likely you're going to come back. Look at that one in 2015. In terms of the top 10 countries for allocations, this is the first time AFRINIC has ever been at the top of a scale in terms of countries. One provider, the local mobile provider, one allocation, it was a /22 or something, you know, and all of a sudden South Africa is the largest. Let's just focus a little bit though on 2016. Now, there's a fair deal of V6 in the United Kingdom thanks to Sky. So 9,000 /32s is kind of okay. Deutsche Telekom is rolling out V6 in Germany, and you know, it's painting the map green. This is terrific. Netherlands, amount of deployment less than 10%. So we gave them an enormous allocation, but I can't see any. United States, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, 1,000 /32s, yeah, growing infrastructure, I dig it. Russia, 1,000 /32s, can't see a single V6 user. Well, I exaggerate, there are a few, but that is a lot of allocation, and there's almost no usage. France, well, until France Telecom gets moving, it'll always stay at where it is. Brazil is kind of moving, but Spain, Italy, and China, there's almost nothing there. The actual managed allocations in those countries is really quite small for usage. So you kind of wonder if the hoarding word is appearing inside all this. So let's have a look at this and try and understand a bit better. So instead of sort of going down that, let me back off and go to the routing system. Because when we hand out a block, you will advertise some of it and not advertise the rest. So the purple line is what the RIR's allocated. You'll notice the discontinuity, and I'm sure Lachnick will explain it to you if you ask Oscar nicely. The one-line summary was that there was a /18, which was a single line block to Brazil, and back in 2013, they broke it back up and started recording the individual allocations out of that block, so the block itself notionally got returned and the individual allocations took back, hence the discontinuity. The green line down the bottom is what we see in the routing system. Steady growth. But the line in the middle is the bits that are unadvertised. Can't see them. Now, what's utilisation in ARIN? You've debated it long and hard, so you should know the answer. You know, it's sort of, I've used about 3/4, 80% of my addresses. And so the whole idea with V4 was to keep that unadvertised amount low so that you kind of got some, used some, got some, used some. But in V6, it's going in a different dimension. Right now, the advertised amount of addresses is about 45%. So 55% of what we've given out so far in all of V6 can't see in the routing system. It's just not there. 45% is visible, 55% is not. What's going on? Back to the country list. In the US, we've given out, and I'll go to /48s because it kind of makes it easy, the equivalent of 10/48s for every single one of your 283 million users in this country. 10/48s per user. You advertise about 1,000 of those /48s, and that's the equivalent of 11/48s per user. Yeah, so. China? In actual fact, there's a lot of users in China, 694 million of them. And so they have about half the allocation size. The amount of allocated 48s is only 2 per user. But advertised, because they don't advertise much, it's actually much higher, 23 per user. You'll see some of these countries are bizarre. Sweden, where are you? Yes, there you are. Due to a complete lack of attention by the regulator years past, I haven't finished yet. The V6 infrastructure was trailing badly, and no particular provider in Sweden felt motivated to actually deploy. So they actually have quite a large allocation, but because there's almost no deployment, what's advertised is spanning very, very few users, less than 1 million. We really can't see it there. So in Sweden, there's this huge amount of allocated space lying idle. And that's one of the bigger ones. Egypt, Taiwan, and Ukraine have a similar kind of situation. So why is there this disparity? Because all of you, in theory, go through the same process of justifying need. Yet the outcomes are radically different, that they vary dramatically from country to country. My suspicion is we're reliving a history when we shouldn't. The whole reason for the RIR system coming up was one of the principles was conservation. We knew there was a timeline. We knew it wasn't going to last forever. We knew we couldn't be profligate. We went through this whole thing about, do you really need it? If you don't need it till tomorrow, I'll give it to you tomorrow. Just wait. Exercise caution. And so a lot of countries now going, right, V6, different rules, I want the lot now. And that's what we're seeing. I want the lot now is dominating a lot of these allocations. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. V6 is prodigious. There is a lot of space. You can't see the twilight of V6 anytime soon. So in some ways, it's not particularly bad that this is happening. But it is interesting to observe that this is an entirely different behaviour by us as an industry, that we are now taking the opposite of conservation and going, some cases, wildly mad, like Sweden, getting stuff when we don't need it yet, because the regulator really hasn't pushed the industry into doing something. I'm going to win that debate sooner or later if I keep returning to it. But that's V6. I want to now turn in the time available to quickly go through V4 and come back to some of the discussions and things you've been seeing about transfers. So the first thing, when do they all run out? The last /8 policies in APNIC and RIPE have actually dramatically changed their picture. APNIC was the first to run out in 2011. Interestingly, that last /8 will run for almost 10 years. We never thought it would last that long. Currently, it's sort of looking at early 2020. The RIPE NCC, they didn't actually stick to a /8. They had whatever they had and put it into a pool they called the last /8. So that they had a larger pool to start with. They'll run through to about 2021. AFRINIC, I don't know how their soft landing policy is going to work. If they did nothing, the middle of next year. If they do something, that will change. LACNIC and ARIN, well, you know where you are. There's nothing down there, right? You know. And that's the kind of decade of allocations that happened over that period. We were doing fine until the global financial crisis. And that's the peak demand of that industry, 2010, 250 million addresses per year. And we had tight policies. So the incipient growth rate 10 years ago was 250 million new addresses per year. My suspicion is right now with the Internet of Stupid Things, you're going to be up to around 500 million per year or higher. Already the Internet has around 12 billion devices all hiding behind NATs. So that incipient growth rate is still going there. And at the moment, NATs are being truly prodigious and just absorbing all that stuff and keeping the stupid things behind barriers. Just think about that when you talk about V6 and no NATs, when you expose the stupid things to the cold light of public networking, what's going to happen to your world? Whoops. And the exhaustion profile, as you see, we are truly running on empty. Where did the addresses go? Again, by country, it's pretty easy to see where they went. Last year, it was almost all Africa. That small amount around the US, there's a certain amount of date wrangling that ARIN do when they do transfers and so on, and it's difficult with ARIN to track dates. So I suspect there's a bit of an echo there. What's left? The available /32s, APNIC about 1/3 of a /8, RIPE about 2/3 of a /8. ARIN has 0, except it has 6 million addresses reserved. What are you reserving them for? Is there a typhoon coming? What's going on there? The RIR system together has got a little over 1/8 reserved. And in some ways, I think you need to be honest, RIRs, including me, with the folk who need addresses to actually understand what you're doing here. Because that's a lot of space. And it's not a public conversation very often about exactly how that's being treated in every single RIR. So yes, there's a lot of reserved space still sitting there, marked reserved, that at some point would alter the picture. Why does it need altering? No one's willing to go all IPv6, no IP4 yet, not even in Sweden. No one's willing to make the jump. We are still addicted to 4. And if you're just hanging on to stuff, you're not helping. So think about that number, think about what you might want to do with it. I want to look at where these addresses are coming from though. Advertised versus unadvertised for 4. Different picture. The unadvertised pool is way down at about 45 /8s. As advertised, it's capped off because we haven't got any more addresses. Right, down there, the unadvertised pool. Let's amplify that up the last 14 months, no longer than that. Oh, no, that's right, start of 2016. Notice how the pool's shrunk in size? Let's put that together with the other 2 lines starting at 0. Over the last 13 months, the RIR system allocated 1.4 /8s. The routing system grew by 2 /8s. We recovered 2/3 of a /8 from the old legacy pools and put them back into action. Thank you. This is what we meant to do with transfers and trading, to take otherwise locked up addresses and actually release them and actually make them useful again. So that is working. And there's still another 45 /8s. I'm not sure what the effort is. I think it gets exponentially hard, and the easy ones have already been flushed. But that pool is being drained to some extent, and it is helping others, and that's a really good thing. So let's have a look at about this, because the aftermarket and the address transfer market is still quite vibrant. Some are sales, some are leases, some are clear, some aren't clear. Let's look at the ones that are clear. Number of transfers per year. As you can see, 2016, big year, 3,700 transfers. First few months of 2017, already at 500. Another big year coming up. Volume, That's a lot of addresses. In 2015, 47 million addresses got moved around. 2016, 33 million. Already this year, 5 million. So there's a fair few addresses actually moving. So let's look at country codes. The US is talking to the US a lot. A lot of addresses are moving. 58 million of them. This is in total across all of the transfer logs. Canada to the US. Canada's a net donor. I hope they got a lot of money for them. Interestingly, the biggest one going out was the US, not to China, but to India. Not to China, but to India. Russia within Russia, you can read it as well as I can. But, you know, there are some surprises. Romania to Saudi Arabia, 1.3 million, didn't expect that. Romania to Iran, a similar amount of space. You know, so let's concentrate on ARIN. Where did ARIN folk export to? Now, the Caribbean's confusing and there aren't very many, so I just simplified it and said, you're just Canada and the US. Sorry, everyone else. Predominant export market, India, then China, and then Canada to India. So around 5.6 million addresses net left to India. And as you can see there, even Australia, we got 500,000 addresses from the US. Thank you very much. Where did you import them from? I think it's mean that you sucked 6,000 badly needed addresses out of St Kitts and Nevis. That was just unfair, okay? Just give them the money and leave them with the addresses. They need your help. But yeah, certainly that's where you imported from, and they are a little bit surprising, some of them. How old? Complicated graph. But I'm trying year by year to understand the age profile of addresses that are transferred. Did someone get it and flip it? Or is this old stuff that you got years and years ago? The purple line is the first year of transfers, 2012. 40% were handed out recently, within that year, less than a year old. So there's a certain amount of get and flip going on. As the years progress, and the last year is the big red, 65% of all the transferred addresses are more than 20 years old. Again, we're transferring our history, which is actually what we wanted. All this talk I hear about speculation and, you know, I got the addresses just to trade. There's almost no evidence. The oldest address that was allocated that got traded was more than 5 years old. So the last /8 material coming out of RIPE and APNIC isn't actually hitting the transfer logs at this point in time. So in some ways, the industry is sort of doing what we expected them to do. How complete are these logs? I don't know. You don't know. Some address brokers might sort of take nuance with what we're saying. They might say you haven't got the complete story. They could well be right. How can we find out? Difficult. They won't tell me. So that's okay. I don't need to know. Let's look at BGP, because routing tells you everything. The address system grew by around 59,000 advertisements, but that's not true. We lost 67,000 and we gained 126,000. The growth is the net, not the actual. So in terms of addresses, 5/8s disappeared, 8/8s appeared across the year. There's a lot of movement there. So I look at that movement and say, is that movement in the transfer logs? So 8,663 of those things are in the transfer logs. Cool. 117,982 aren't. Confused. I am. So there's a lot of movement that we're not actually recording in the registry for whatever reason. And you can certainly categorize them and go, well, what's listed and what's unlisted? We capture about 10% of the movement, and the rest we don't capture. So we're sort of seeing 1/10 of the movement of addresses. Now, we don't know what's transfers and what's other bits of movement. Totally not. But I do know of the things that moved and changed. Around 10% of them are our transfer logs. I look at the age of these things, and interestingly, the age profile is very similar to the transfer age profile. 20% of all these removed addresses are more than 20 years old. 50% of this is more than 10 years old. So basically this is old stuff moving, same as we see in the transfer log. So what can I say about this? We're doing a decent job with a bit of it, but we're not doing a good job with all of it. And that kind of disturbs me a bit, because when we start moving addresses from people, person to person, either you use a registry for the way in which the new owner can say to everyone else, it's my addresses now. It's no one else's but mine. Registries are a common public asset. If you do this stuff under the table, you're relying on lawyers. You're relying on bilaterals and letters of association. And that leads to chaos within seconds, because not everyone knows. Not everyone can tell. Not everyone understands what's going on versus what's in the registry. And once reality and the registry start to diverge, this industry has a problem. And so that number worries me, because 90% we don't understand is a really, really big number. So what this means, we need to look harder and do more work, and there's a lot more analysis that needs to happen here, and I'm willing to put my hand up and do some of it, but you're going to have to do some too. We've really got to understand why a lot of that movement isn't being recorded, what's going on, and to what extent arrangements like leasing and other forms that aren't naturally expressed in the registry, maybe we need a way to express that to at least understand that these days there is a subtle difference between the owner, the title holder of a title, and the person who's knocking at your door saying, please route this address, I've got the use of it today. And understanding that distinction might well give us some more insight into making our registries more reflective of reality. I did it, I made it. I've got 4 minutes to go for questions. Thank you very much. Sure. Alain, I think you're up first.
Yeah, Alain Durand, speaking on my own behalf, not on any of my employers, past, present, or future.
Future.
You're talking about addresses that are moving, but that are not transfers by definition. And you see that there are 90% that are not recorded. I will actually make the case that it's much worse than that, because there are things that are moving around, but that are not shown into the BGP table, simply because there are private contracts that we have heard about, where people locking addresses for the next 5 years, and they are simply not used yet. So those private contracts, by definitions, are private, and we have no idea how many there are. Maybe some of the brokers know how many there are, but from an outside perspective, we have absolutely no idea. So I would say that there are actually 3 categories. There are things that are transferred, that are recorded properly. There are things that are under lease contract, LOAs, that are advertised into the routing tables, that we see somehow but not recorded. And there are things that are simply not seen at all because they are locked into private contract. And the question is, why are people doing that? And I will posit that there's an underlying theme behind that, and your previous data that you were showing about why people are having all those IPv6 allocations and not apparently using them. It would appear as if all those things are essentially insurance policies, bet edges against what could happen. Like maybe it would be more difficult in the future to get V6 addresses. I'm going to get them now, so I don't have to worry about it. Or I'm going to buy addresses, not transfer them, buy them, because the price is cheap now and I think that it may go higher. So all those like hedging things. And as a community member, again, not speaking about on behalf of any of my employees, I'm wondering how we should really approach those betting and hedging things. Should we have some kind of a mechanism to really deal with it?
What was that comment yesterday about long speeches disguised as questions? However, I do agree with your observation, and certainly from the RIR's perspective, as an allocator who kept a record of what they allocated to a full-blown registry operator, seeing a movement of resources beyond simple allocation, there are many questions like the ones you've raised. And I suspect we need to look closely in these kinds of policy meetings about how we continue to make our common registry our common asset, the thing we consult to understand where and why an address. And if we can achieve that, I think we will have fulfilled our basic mission. But you're right, there are a lot of challenges. So thank you for a few more. Yeah, sure.
Peter Timish, Adrex. Geoff, as always, entertaining and filled with so much data. We parse it all back in our offices. but I'm going to repeat this every time I get a chance to say it, and Axel's here. RIPE purposely, through its policy process, has decided not to list transfers of legacy space. So you keep always bringing it up, but I want to make sure everyone knows there are transfers that legitimately are getting updated in the registry in RIPE with the correct information and updated. It's just not in the list of the transfers because it's not covered under current rules.
I would desperately like to see all of us adopt a common transfer log format. I would like all of us to understand dates. I would like all of us to publish these logs, not only of transfers, but of things that happen. You know, end of Geoff getting down on his knees, pleading with the RIR system to do what Geoff wants. But why do I think it's use? Because I really think there's a feedback loop between the policies you make and the industry you're working in. And what you really want to do is make good policies that make this industry work better. And certainly registries and understanding the transactions helps us all do better policy. So yes, I don't really like the idea that data gets discarded or hidden, and it's a pity. And it would be nice if we could get a more complete picture. But you know, I've said that to the RIPE NCC folk as well. We all understand the problem, and I suspect folk are working on it, and I would dearly like to think so. Thank you. Sure.
As it turns out, you'll hear some of this tomorrow, there are efforts among the RIRs to get one step closer. I would never say aligned, but one step closer to alignment in the areas we can on common log file format, and so we're getting there. There are some places where we may not ever agree. Country codes, dates, there's a few other little things, but we are, there's an effort going on right now between the 5 RIRs to try to get at least the first round of alignment done. And Mark will say a little bit about that, but we are making progress.
I think the front microphone.
Okay. Hi, Chris Woodfield, Salesforce, ARIN AC. Just one quick thing to point out is that unused space does not equal unadvertised space. And where I'm going with this is I'm wondering when you might go back to the difference between allocated v6 space versus routed v6 space. In an IPv4 world, it's common practice for people to use RFC 1918 for internal networks. In v6, there's no reason to do that. There is a ULA, but my anecdotal information says that most people just take a block out of their public space for any internal application. Actually, I'll put Dan on the spot and ask him, does Comcast use ULA space or public space for your private v6 routing?
It's all public.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm wondering how much of the unadvertised v6 space could be explained by that practice, if any.
You know, the problem is because it's private, it's really hard for researchers like me to come in from the outside and poke and twiddle. There is a lot of work going on right now, and there's been some interesting papers done with Akamai data over the true usage of v4, because everyone goes to Akamai, don't they? And this is kind of interesting stuff, and it's sort of stuff we hadn't really thought about before, about how to think of the distinction between used in a public context, used as in advertised, versus allocated, and understanding a bit more of that. Why? Because again, it helps us make policies that reflect reality. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you. I think the front, Elvis, and then, yeah.
Yeah, Elvis Velavi for Escrow. We had a pretty good chat last night about lots of these things. First of all, legacy space, parts of it does get published by the RIPE NCC, and that's the inter-RIR transfers that happen. Only what happens within RIPE does not get published. But let's hope we'll get to fix that as well. Then the second thing I wanted to mention is, have you noticed that in the RIPE region there were, well, about 200 transfers in 2014? No, yeah, 200 transfers in, no, actually, sorry, I got my numbers wrong. About 920 transfers in 2014, while in 2015 they jumped to 2,700. I have a feeling that the reason for that was the cleanup of the IPv4 policy in the RIPE region at the end of 2014, which actually ended up in removing the needs policy.
So,
So-
you're supposing there was a correlation. You might well be right. I don't know.
So I have a feeling that by removing the needs-based policy, in maybe the ARIN region as well, APNIC I know they have a proposal, but let's see if it actually happens. I have a feeling that if this will happen, then most of the transfers will surface. Most of what is hidden under lawyerish, futures, whatever contracts will surface, because there will be no reason for people to get addresses and not put them in their name anymore.
At some point, you're crossing into a boundary of advocating policy, and that's a fine thing to do, but probably when that policy comes up for discussion, ARIN might well be the right place.
And the
yes.
last thing I wanted to mention is, you're saying that about 90% of what's happening is not visible. Or we don't, well, it's visible, but we don't know what it actually
The routing
is.
system said it changed. I couldn't see it in the transfer log. I am confused.
So that means, considering the 2/8 that were a bit more than 2/8 that were transferred in 2016, that means that about 18/8 have been changing stuff, but not.
Somewhere down here, I have it listed. I've forgotten where. Details. I don't memorize my numbers. 16,000 were removed. Root prefixes 20,000. Haven't done the address space there. A fair amount. A fair amount is all I can say.
If we think of it like a number of addresses, if 2/8 were transferred in total in 2016, and that's only 10%, then that means that about 18/8 are.
I don't know, and that's the whole thing. They moved in routing. I couldn't see them in transfer. That's where it stops at this point. We don't know. We'll make it quick because I'm eating into
I'll be
your
very
break
quick.
time.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire.
Thank
I think that's the key. The routing table has changed. I haven't seen them in the transfer log, but I shouldn't necessarily correlate the two because that's a really bad idea. The fact the routing table has grown makes perfect sense. When we've run out of space in the free pool, we're going to disaggregate, we're going to use smaller blocks. That makes sense. Stuff moving around, Geoff, is also very explained because there's a lot of legacy space. People use 24s and whatever it may be, 21s, 20s, from their upstream years ago that are now being reclaimed and reused. People are being more careful about the space that they gave out originally, are starting to reclaim it back and reuse it on their own networks. So it might have been advertised on network X and pulled into Y. But I just want to be very careful not to correlate the routing table with the transfer, because 90% is a very aggressive way to explain that there's a problem when that might not be a problem.
So what I'm saying here, and it's sort of down there, there's a large body of movement. It's not in the transfer log is what I can say, but I can't say why. And you're exactly saying the same thing. It needs more work, right? It needs more investigation. Yes. Thank you. Owen.
Owen DeLong, Akamai Technologies. The document Geoff alluded to is the State of the Internet report, which we publish periodically, and it's readily available from the Akamai website for anyone who's interested. All kinds of wonderful statistics about how people are using addresses, and we've got a reasonably good vantage point on that,
And
I
a
think.
blindingly good research paper by a young kid called Philip Richter from the University of Berlin,
Yeah.
with Dave Plonker from your organisation. And if you want a really nice piece of research to read when you can't sleep tonight, go and read it. It's amazing.
It
He
will indeed
even
help you sleep.
uncovers the behaviour of DHCP address pools. I'm like, it's so cool. So yeah, it's a nice piece of work. Kudos to him.
Coming back to the 90% that's not accounted for in the transfer market, I think, probably half of that is likely explained in ISP churn and people moving their PAI prefixes among different ISPs. I know we do quite a bit of that on a fairly regular basis ourselves.
I leave it to budding young 20-year-olds who want their master's degree to investigate fully. Thank you very much.
Hey, wait.
Oh, sorry.
Geoff, one more. Geoff, one question. John Sweeting with ARIN. Just on your reserve blocks, you had 6 million.
Yes, I did.
So the majority, 2/3 of those are our special 410 and 4.4 for IPv6 deployment. I'm not really sure why they get designated differently than other special purposes for new entrants and the other RIRs.
In the crude terminology of reserved, allocated, and available. They're available, just not under the old policy.
Correct.
And it would have been, I suppose, easier if it's 4 million to have marked them as available, because your policy on handing them out is different, but they're still available.
Yeah, and the other 2 million are the reserved and are revoked and returned that we covered earlier.
So
So
you're
they're
saying-
available, but they won't be available till
You're
future.
saying with a simple change of nomenclature, you've reduced the pool by 4 million. Well done. Good
Thank
work. Thank you.
Okay.
Geoff,
Thank you.
Jeff, one remote question.
Oh, sorry.
Kevin Ote from Flying Penguin. Jeff says we have an IPv4 addiction. Do we need a 12-step program or just go cold turkey?
I couldn't possibly comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Very good.